just going to start with having people look at the bench ends across from you. Probably haven't spent that much time looking at the design, but you follow, you're right on the edge of one design. Doesn't go much further south, but there's a kind of a line almost, there's another one about whether you say Dempsey or what's the other word? In the south there's another word for Dempsey, and there's a line which goes from Tiverton just about here, and there's a north and the south divide, and the same thing with cut rounds. There's a north and south divide. What you have is more Renaissance than anything in the south, and by that I mean this particular one here, which is repeated in a number of places. It's here, it's here, it's on this side, and it's a sea creature which rises up. There's also foliage which is typical of that, and then design which really doesn't mean anything, and a holdover which may have been on one of the aisles of Gothic foliage. And when you look at these panels, you'll realize they kind of fit together, they kind of don't. And that's typical of Devon. And when you go over on this side, you see some more, none over there, but then they're reused in the front, and this is because of the Victorians. And on the whole, which we're going to look at, Devon didn't have the money in the early 1800s to keep upgrading churches. So it kept with what it had on the whole. Other parts of the country, like Manchester or Liverpool, they were building new churches, or they had the money to renovate their old ones. So these kind of benches disappear. But in Devon, people have sat in them for close on 500 or more years. Your backs, the rails, are original. So you're not noticing these, but those have been here for 500 years as well. I can't remember about the seat itself, but the Victorians were delighted in Devon to find so much. They renovated these. The rest of the country get rid of their box pews and introduced bench ends. Now, the repairs that were made recently, you can see with the old wood and the new wood. So that's very recent with the fire and the tower, all the rest. But the Victorians reintroduce bench ends or just before the Victorians in the rest of the church. So you have medieval, Victorian restoration, and then repair damage done with those, with the blonder wood that you see there. And I think I've got an example there which you can see in the church itself, new and old. And that the Victorians did very well. This is just foliage. That is a copy of a Victorian copy of what was here before. This is more interesting, but you're not going to be able to see it. In the mid-1800s, an antiquarian cleric came here to record the church and did two little drawings of the benches. And one of them is the sea creature, which we're going to look at properly in a few minutes, and the other is that geometric foliage there, which is that one there, but that's a copy. So what we're going to do is look at design and try to understand it. I'm hoping I'll keep you in the dull bit, because there is a dull bit coming up, but if you concentrate and you get your way through it, it does help later on. I did a book on it for the Pilgrim Trust and English Heritage. They were concerned with what's happening here. This was quite a few years ago with reordering, because 15 to 20 years ago when reordering started, we would have places get rid of everything in the church. And dealers would get a hold of the wood, pay a pittance, if anything, for it, and then sell them on the antique market for a fortune. And the heritage is gone. So I went into one East Anglian church It was full of broken plastic chairs. The vicar had sold the bench ends. They were left with the plastic chairs because he wanted to play his music. He had a little guitar group. He left, the chairs collapsed, and now they had no place to sit. Their nice seats had been sold as antique coffee tables in New York. I was told Saudi Arabia as well, but I don't know if that's actually true. So, what you're looking at around you is very much southwest and really Devon. Once you leave the southwest, we don't have anything like this at all. That is a normal bench end in the Midlands. What you're looking at is generally, if it's an old one piece of oak, solid, 3 to 4 inches thick. These are composites. They're little assembly pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, and sometimes up to 6 or 7 pieces of wood put together in almost like a buttress style. You get that in the north of Somerset coming in later. Now and then modern churches in Devon have this, but it's really nothing to do with Devon at all. The other big area which has bench ends is East Anglia, and that is a typical bench end in East Anglia. I wonder, can we turn some of the lights off? I don't know where the switch is. You just might be able to see better. If we can kill that one, maybe this one. Yeah. Well, it encourages romance. You never know. I met at the Hatherleigh local history group, and we're together 20 years later. Could be a family story. Almost there.
Getting there. Oh, perfect.
That's easier, isn't it? Okay, so what we have in East Anglia is something very different. They approach it in a different way. We carve the ends, they carve the edges. They have towers on either side with either a poppy head on the top and then these little finials which are either at your elbow or at your shoulder size. But they are very different from something in Devon. We just carve hair. And sometimes they do the rail as well. Well, that style didn't get to us, and on the whole, we don't have this, which a lot of the rest of the country does, and having a finial poppy head, a design at the top which rises out of the bench. We don't know what that is about. There are lots of really interesting designs all across the country. There are a handful here which I'm going to show. There's some, well, there are more in Somerset and Cornwall than in Devon. That one, I have no idea what it means. That one, I'm fairly confident is George and the Dragon. If not, there's another legend running alongside of it. But we don't have many in Devon. What we do, like I say, is along the side. So, 463 ancient churches. Go to all of them. The only things that you can find to tell us about them are parish records, generally church warden accounts, church records. There's one book written in 1916, another in 1969, which isn't nearly as good as the 1916. A book on Heartland, and then another book on book bench ends across the country, but really only Somerset and Suffolk have yet histories of their bench ends. So Devon was a major advance having a bench end book. It's the best book on bench ends in Devon. It's the only book on bench ends in Devon. This is the sort of material that tells us things. So in the church court, there's, if you've been to Sandford, they've got a very nice collection. It tells us that the benches were erected in 1584. as we'll be looking at where you're sitting now, you had a choice. People sat where they wanted. In the 16th and the 17th century, you were prescribed a seat. It's financial. How much money you give to the church rate depends on, that depends on where you sit. So the more money you pay at the front, the closer to the pulpit, the closer you get, the poorer are in the back. And sometimes they're standing. So at Sanford, a unmarried woman tried to force her way into a married woman's pew, and the woman got angry. She had told her to stop doing it. She wouldn't listen, so she brought to church with her a big pin. And as the woman passed in front of her, she took the pin and shoved it up the woman's backside, causing the woman to start screaming in church. And everybody said, I heard her say, ow, 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 ow. And that was the dispute in 1584. The dispute says that's when the seats were put in. So we're able to fix the date. Now, we generally think that they're in a range, and we're going to look at the actual years. I would have thought yours is something like 1520s, 1530s. So they're coming up to 500 years. Now, what I do, I go to all these churches, went to all the churches in Devon, nearly all of them in the southwest, and then another 400 in the rest of the country, and you try to identify what you have. You have this extraordinarily boring form that you fill in. So you go to a church like this and you see these seats. They're not bench ends, they're 17th century carving, which is later, more embellished. There are no obvious seats in the church because they're all Victorian, but you look up in the gallery and you notice some old carving. Most of those are from the screen because they're very narrow and thin, whereas in the middle here, there are two bench ends. So we've got the little screen panel there, but those are the two bench ends which they carved down to the bits that they wanted to keep. A pelican with her young, and then IHC for Jesus with a crown of thorns. So they kept a few bench ends. You go up into the church, into the balcony, you can see how thick that wood is, whereas the rest of it's very thin. So what I do, we go around Devon, record all the benches, make notes of them, and then see what you have. Well, there's terminology. In Devon, they call them sedges, from the Latin seat, sedes. This isn't an aisle, it's an alley. On top of the screen, between here and the chancel, is a loft, and then the rood above it. What you have in front of you, we might call a kneeler or a hassock, but they called them tuts and butts, depending on where you are. So I have one woman who threw her, a butt woman who threw her butt into the alley, and I had a long time before I understood what she actually meant by that. Older women earned a living from putting out the kneelers, and they were called butt or tut women. Georgian, Victorian. So, in Devon, we've got 2,500 plus bench ends. That's 124 out of our 463 churches. Some only have one bench end. Others, like Heartland, have over 100. So you've got just all across the county in different sizes, different shapes, different designs, different numbers. What may have been kept here may have been representative, or may have not have been. Maybe they kept the unusual ones. We don't know, but we know there are 30 of them out of probably 150 originally. So, this is the boring bit. We start off with seats being a stool or a form, movable. So you look out across there, a form is just a bench without a back. So in East Anglia, they still have churches with forms. You sit bolt upright for the whole service. Benches were brought in to give you comfort. People complain these aren't comfortable. But in 1500, having a back was luxury. We go to about 1600, maybe 1580, 1590 in Devon, where that's the fashion, and then we go to high seats. So we would have a gentry area here, lord of the manor, or the gentry family, would have a high seat which you couldn't see into, and it had a door, and the door could be locked. The high quality gives you privacy and keeps out any wind, any drafts. Nobody can see what's happening, so we go into the 17th century when the high seats are fashionable and the vicars start saying they're sleeping boxes. People aren't paying attention. They bring in books, they bring in food. They can do this because nobody can see them except for the vicar if he's high in the pulpit. Now that carries on, becomes aspirational, so it goes into the nave, and then about 1820 or so, and I think you're 1825 when you're reseated, we start to go back to benches and chairs. And that's because there's a feeling in the Church of England that the toffs shouldn't be sitting in a high seat having a little glass of wine and a sandwich while the rest of you are all in uncomfortable seats. The idea in the Anglican Church is we're all equal before God. Whatever happens out in the real world, once you come in here, everybody's the same. Nobody's backside deserves more attention than anybody else's. So you all sit in exactly the same seats. And that's what we're looking at here. So a visitor comes to the church in the mid-1800s and says, what a shame that you did all of your seats except the gentry still have the best seats kept separate from everybody else. But it's the class system brought into church. So that's why we have these, because of the sense of egalitarianism. And then of course lately, people want more upholstered seats. We're reordering. We're getting movable seats in order to make the space differently used. So we have different phases going on with our seating. So we see this church with what you might say are box pews, the high seats. So if you go to Tor Bryan in the south of Devon, it looks like a high seat, but you open a door and there's a bench end. Usually when they put high seats in, you get rid of the benches and you have wider pieces of wood to sit on. They've got all the comfort of 1500 set in the height of the early 1800s. Oh, sorry, early 1700s probably. So inside that, there you can see the high, but with the bench below it. And you do get this in other places. So the Victorians despaired of this. Middle class people were sitting in the benches, the gentry on the right in their own little pew, and then the poor standing in the back, who aren't given anything to sit in. Now, there is one other group, which are servants. And sometimes servants are given that seat at the end of the bench in the aisle. So you're sitting there, twisted to look at the vicar in the pulpit the whole time. And they are literally about that big. So you're really punishing your servant. And you find that all over East and Somerset, there's a whole group of them. But in Devon, the only ones we have are Clovelly, and then the Victorians brought them in at Ilfracombe. So they are unusual. Now, as far as sitting in different places, if you look at Wembury, this is a plan of the church. You can see everybody's names and numbered pews. In the top, this bench is for the vulgar to sit upon. The poorest were on the north wall. And if we look at the few plans we have like this, all the seats are specified. The middle row of seats the women sit in. And on these seats, that's for the farmers. Now there are curiosities in that, and one of them is about women's seating. This, according to many histories, which I think they're all wrong, would say women are on the north, men are on the south. Men can sit in the south because on a Sunday morning when the sun comes in and the heat makes you feel overly warm, men are rational, easygoing creatures that a bit of heat doesn't disturb their temperaments. It would with women. So the theory is you put them on the cold side to keep them down so that they're more controllable. Now this is an extraordinary theory which is repeated by historian after historian without a sense of irony. And just because the Victorians said it and made it up, I don't know why it's still being repeated. But it is. Now, so there are three things which I think are wrong. One of them is about pulpits. You will read that as soon as the pulpits came in the Reformation, we needed seats. But the Catholics had pulpits and the Catholics had seats. It's just something somebody made up. And the other thing is, whether it's the English or foreign craftsmen, often what's written, particularly by the Victorians, is those carvings are too good for English craftsmen. But I can't find one foreign craftsman in any Devon church. It's all English. And usually about 10 miles away at the most. It's within working distance of where that person lives. And I suspect it's an older man with a young lad learning how to do it. I think that's the form. These are possibly Breton, which is at Colebrook, not far from Crediton. And those designs are similar to things you can see in Brittany, although not as benchends. The earliest seats we have recorded, Dartmouth 1438, 1475 from Totnes, but the Synod at Exeter in 1287 talks about movable seats. So we know the seats were there. We know they're going in the 1400s as fixed benches. So they are here in that form 500 plus years ago, I think. Now, well, the way people have tried to interpret them has been very imaginative because there hasn't been the research. So church warden trying to make up a parish history or a church history has scrambled to try to find an explanation. So at Morthoe, the church guide will tell you that this is the first Australian kangaroo in Devon, and that unknown to history, a craftsman in North Devon went to Australia, saw kangaroos, came back, and put them in the church. In Budley, this is the first banana being eaten in England. Also in Budley, this is a red Indian. Now it does look a bit like a red Indian. You know, it could be a first American, but if you notice, the leaves go all the way around, and this is a leaf head. It's a Renaissance design, not one you have. It's like a green man, only the green man has tendrils coming out of the nose, or the mouth, the ears, or another orifice. That's the leaf head there, and that's our leaf head in Budley. But that's almost the only Renaissance design in all of East Devon. So Sanford thinks these are Aztecs, and the guide will tell you that the Aztecs were sitting in Mexico, and somebody said, oh, did you know there are manor houses in England? And one of them said, oh, that's interesting. To the other one, I didn't know there was such a thing. Why don't we go there and look at an English manor house? So they got in a boat, they arrived in Devon, they walked to Sanford to find a manor house, and the carpenter happened to see these Aztecs going by. Now, this story is repeated so often, people will tell you as if it's true. What it is typical Renaissance design. Whether it's meant to be a Greek or an African, I don't know. But you get it all across Europe at the time. Here's another church in North Devon with the same thing. What we have in North Devon and coming down towards here are figures on shields, which were roundels, and these are Renaissance designs, but these have been updated in a Devon way. I don't know what the meaning of this is, but there's a lot of tongues. Either maybe it's about gossip or slander, maybe they're singing, maybe they're just being offensive with one another. But you get versions of that, which is very different. In North Devon, we have upside down letters and upside down tools, but we'll explain that in a minute. We have religious imagery, which doesn't make it down to you, but that may be because they've been destroyed. So there is a rare example of Jesus, which is at Broadwood Widger near Oakhampton. The one on the right is like something you have. There's a version of that on this side. This is foliage which could be just as old at Tetcott, which is only done in the parishes around there, I think by one craftsman. And that's the extent of his work. But that's a taste of some of the design. What we're looking at is a design which can be vertical and in a short span. So it can't be a hunting scene running across the fields because you have to go straight up and down. So the designs can be different from a monument or from a launder, from one of these, or on the pulpit, or on the font, which the design has to be something you can see in the round. Bench ends have a particular shape which doesn't suit bosses. So we have the three hares, famous from Devon, misnamed as being the tinner's hair. We thought it was, but we know it isn't. We know it's medieval. We know it comes from China, crosses the whole of Asia into Europe. That doesn't appear in any bench end whatsoever. Instead, we've got to look at other designs. So what do we go for? Well, these are all our churches with benches, bench ends. You see less in the South Hams, and that's because the rural dean in the early 1700s ordered them destroyed in the rural deanery around Totnes. So that's why we've got so few down there. Now, look at this. Nice bit of carving at High Bickington. If you want to go to an interesting church, High Bickington is great. We have a version of that. A little vine going up. Maybe some kind of a pomegranate, berries, flowers. It's different from that one next to it. The flowers are almost like sunflowers looking out at you. Next one is different again. Two flowers and two little heads. They look more like leaf heads. You can see the leaves going all around them. But the next one, they're different again. And you begin to wonder, what is the craftsman doing? Is the carpenter having fun? Slightly different on this one. And slightly again on that one. So you go through the church, and you may not notice until you sit down that each one is inventive. There's imagination and skill put in the slight differences as you go through the church. Why? You know as much as I do. And it's not until one looks a bit closer than one realizes they're not always the same, and there's something going on. They're highly skilled workers, but what does that design mean? The problem we have is there's nothing that survived in manuscript by a craftsman, a carver, to say this is what this design means. So we have to fall back on what we can interpret. So some of them it's showing ownership. So with this one, it's etched into, they've carved into the wood and then filled it up with this black putty. The initials probably of the owner of the pew. Other times there's a date and initials, which is really helpful in dating the pew, which is great, if that's what it means. I suppose that's an N. Could be 2 I's. Now and then you get heraldry, which you have over here, the third one in, which has been borrowed from another place. These are the only poppy heads like this that we have in Devon and Cornwall, and this comes from a gentry chapel which was taken down and they were moved into a church. So it's not a straightforward church, but those finials that I said we have in Devon are few and far between. I'm not sure what the meaning is, but I think that's a lion. It's not a bad lion by somebody who's never seen a lion. He's been beheaded. So is he. This, I think, is a bear as a monk, which may be a bit of satire about the church. This one is a bit hard to understand at first, but when you look at it, it's a dog chasing a fox. And the fox has grabbed somebody's goose or duck. That's the goose's head. And then that's the goose's body, because he's flown it over his head and he's running with it on its back. It's a common image you get across England of a dog chasing a fox who's taken some poultry. But for Devon, there are some general rules. So what we do, we have a carved border. We have Gothic tracery like it's a window. We fill that Gothic tracery and the panel with an image. Sometimes it's a saint in the north, or more often we have a shield with something on the shield. That's more normal than anything else. And in the bottom, it's a geometric device, Gothic, like a cinquefoil, trefoil, quatrefoil, something geometric on the bottom. So the border can be quite bizarre. This is one church near Teignmouth where it's all creatures of the night. But generally it's a foliage border. In the south of Devon, it's good middle-class taste. I think it's safe. What we have in those places to the south and hardly any to the north, blank tracery. So it's almost like looking at a whole group of windows. And some churches will have one design. So the whole church is filled with tracery of one shape, but often you go around Devon and you see the odd one, which is different than any other one, including ones at Honeychurch, which are quite old, maybe older than they really look like being. So this bit of stained glass at Hatherleigh, it shows blank Gothic tracery. I call it good English middle class taste. It's refined, it doesn't say anything, it's a bit dull. So, those are our leaf heads, which we talked about before. And the big point, the thing which I was really proud of with the research I was able to do, is to show Devon, from here to the north, has more Renaissance carving of the 1500s, early 1500s, than all of the rest of England put together. Now, we didn't realize that because the few people looking at Devon bench ends hadn't looked outside. And you have to go around and look at every church and every bench end. So, what Renaissance design do we have? Well, here's some here. I'm not sure the date of these, but I think they were taken from a high seat. They're at Bideford. It's all version of the same character. And I pointed out in Bideford how they look all the same. And I said, well, it's like a village where people all look very similar. And this one old boy said out from the village, from the back, in Bideford, we all know each other very well. I thought, well, I don't think it's that well. But that design is a version of this. So we have these roundels like coins. So you're looking at like a picture of Caesar. They come into London in the 1520s at Hampton Court. I think at the exact same time they come into North Devon. There are some really nice early examples at Powderham Castle. I think as we go into the 1500s, Devon starts to put those faces elsewhere. So you can see they're now not on their own, but put together. Devon has a penchant for a man and a woman leaning towards each other as if they're about to smooch. You don't get that elsewhere. That's a North Devon design. But this is what you have a version of. An arabesque going up. So here we have our two figures at the top. Then we have this arabesque shape with little heads. Here's another version of it with a little putti at the top, which can be either a full figure little fat boy, like an angel, or just a head with wings. But the thing which is really Devon, that Devon likes out of all Renaissance, is what you have. This little figure here. A little sea creature. It's not quite a merman, it's a sea creature. And this is what you have, I think about 8 or 9 of. So you pick up on it, you can see he's looking my way, and the other one is looking the other way. Does everybody see that figure? Is that making sense? So why is it here? Are you the furthest south that Renaissance design hits? Pretty much. So we go back to that. The interesting thing is the shield. We hadn't appreciated just how much Devon loves a good shield, because we do it everywhere. Now look at some of the designs. Now I think the one on the right is a satire of the church. The one on the left, I don't know what he is, but he's what's called a hybrid, a mixture of animal and human. Not quite one thing, not quite the other. The one on the left is outside of Bideford, and what I think he is, because this is the only one in the southwest, but you get this in the rest of the country, it's a monkey holding a pot of urine. And this is a satire of medical men, because they thought it was hilarious to have medical men saying, if you looked at somebody's urine, you could tell about their health. Oh, what a ridiculous notion that is. So they're monkeys. So you get versions of this everywhere. So that one I think I'm fairly confident of. But why a little chunky boy or man has got a bow and arrow riding backwards on a horse? I don't know. There's a dragon, which could be the devil, may not be the devil. It could be heraldic. Curious designs to have, and it begs the question, who pays for this? Is it the person who sits in the seat? In which case, do you want to look at that? I'm wondering if that may be a jester's bauble. You know how a jester would have a little doll on a stick which looked like them, and it was a device. I wonder if that's what that is. The one on the right looks huffy. This is even better. Angels with bat wings. The only ones you have are one church near Bideford. They're the only ones I could find anywhere in England. So a craftsman has come up with an idea. Now, where's Marion? Marion was going to do this for us. Marion, could you do the one on the left, and we'll get another volunteer to do one on the right, and then somebody else to pull you apart at the end. I don't know what this means. Yoga at 1500. And they're very careful with their modesty. Is it just that they had a Gothic arch and it was funny to contort people into it? Is that the joke? Billy Bunter. I don't know why that man is like that. That's our little sea creatures. Or is the carpenter having fun carving interesting things because you get bored after a week of doing the carving, so you want something else? This is the inventiveness of the bench ends. So you go around and you notice this is the only one like that at Tostock, the only one like it in England, as far as I can see. So some of these you begin to wonder. Curious creature to have in a church. All right, I'll save you next. So, a creature being eaten by another from the back, or is he disgorging the other creature? So we've got one in Devon. And you look at them all and you think, what is happening? What is this about? And it reminds you of illuminated manuscripts. When this was common in the 1200s and 1300s. Is it an echo of that? Of fun and fantastic animals to amuse, to delight the eye. But it's a religious setting. So, the other interesting thing we have are instruments of the Passion. So you look at these, and they're all to the north. All up here. Nothing in the south. Well, we've got in the north saints. Sometimes the faces are cut off. Sometimes both of them aren't. And with this one, one is, one isn't. There are a handful of crucifixions in the southwest. I think it's 4. This is one where the head of Jesus was actually removed. And you can see both of Mary and John's faces were taken off. They were literally defaced. We have a handful of these. Does it occur to anybody what they think this is? I think it's the head of John the Baptist. With an elongated neck to show it's been cut off. But often what you have are the 5 wounds of Christ, the hands, the feet, the heart. Or just the feet with the marks in them. I think this is the hand of Judas with the bag with the coins. The nails going into Jesus, the pliers which take him out when he's taken off of the cross. The whips. We've got the vinegar, and we've got the arrow or the sword which pierces Jesus as well. Peter's keys, and then the ear of Malchus, which is cut off in the Garden of Gethsemane. They don't always get the correct ear. I can't remember if it's right or left, but sometimes it's the wrong one. And then the one on the right, I think, is a Roman soldier spitting at Jesus. But I may be wrong on that. Here's a Roman soldier, I think, whipping Jesus. That we have two of in Devon. And then those tools, the hammer to put in the nails, and the pincer to take out the nails. What's interesting is only in North Devon, a bit of Cornwall, do we have instruments of the and a bit of Somerset, just a handful, do we have instruments of the Passion on benches. Whereas in East Anglia, they don't have them on the bench ends, they reserve them for their fonts. We don't do it on our fonts. So different traditions. In East Anglia, they do the 4 seasons, the vices, the virtues. We don't, because I don't think it occurred to us to do it. Somebody did up there, and they copy them in church after church after church. So, now and then we get folk art. A woman on the left at a half door with some sort of poultry hanging down, and she's holding on to a tail of a dog. Whereas the one on the right is a man with a pitchfork. Man on the left with some tools in a bag, and maybe that's a crook on the right. This I'm not sure what it means, but I was told by the V&A that that codpiece dates into the 1580s. They're codpiece specialists. This is a difficult one. In Bugley, it's known as a sheep because it's got cloth shears above. In East Anglia, they will have them on the right, and they call them beavers, who are biting off their genitals because those are being collected by hunters, and they'll be killed if they have them, so they bite them off in order to save their lives. When I said that to Bugley, the front row nearly fainted. May be wrong, but I don't know of a sheep that can do that. There are some benches, very few, where you have an indication of the tools, and I think those are craftsmen's tools who carve the benches. And this is the thing you may not have noticed. We have secondary carving on our benches. We do more of it in Devon than anywhere else. You have a bit of metal, you put a design on the bottom, and then you hit it with a hammer into the wood. A form of stippling. Sometimes it's just a little dot, but it's intricate to that design. It brings out the fact that it's a flower. The Victorians noticed that. So in East Bugley, they noticed there's a range of these punch marks. So 2, 4, 6, and 1 stipple. Yeah. One of those marks may be at Woodbury Church, but that's the only time I can find 2 marks for punches in 2 different churches. So that's what you can find in Devon. Very distinct. The one on the right I call the Sandford Clover, because I thought that was a clever name for it. Now and then, they're very distinctive. So there's a little tower on the bottom, and it's key to the design. But when you look at this one here, somehow that design fits this little fox. It's almost like this is how he's walking in the snow. It's like little footprints. But we hadn't noticed before secondary carving. But we weren't very good at noticing what the designs were. It's all about observation. It's like this church, you can see 3 different carved angels in this church. You know, there's one here, there's another one on either side, another in the first aisle. Well, what are the dates of those angels? When did they come in? It's not a huge point, but it's about observation and asking questions. And with these benches, nobody's been looking at how interesting I think they are. It's all about observation. So what we have is, in Devon, one of the two largest collections in England, Southwest and East Anglia, 1400s, early 1500s, most of them. Local men. How unique the designs are. You go to one church, Alwynton, High Bickington, and you think, crumbs, I've never seen anything like this. Well, you won't unless you go to that church. You go to another church, and you think, this is nothing like the last church. Just north of Barnstable, there's a church with no bench ends. I found a Victorian's drawings of those benches in the 1840s. They're not repeated in Devon, only in that church. And they're gone. One piece of paper records them. So we have to ask, there are differences between parts of Devon. Is it all about the church warden, what they want, and what the carpenter is able to do, what they're able to afford, or what he likes doing? And we have more Renaissance than anywhere else. That's remarkable. To think the Renaissance comes to North Devon earlier than other parts of England, that's astounding. So what we do, we go out to churches, you have an interesting morning looking at the bench ends, you put a bit of money into the church door. If more and more people did that, it would transform the lives of these buildings. And if you write into the book what wonderful carvings you have, how lucky you are to have these, church wardens will know what they have is special. So the carvings you have, which I hope we're all going to look at tonight, are special. It's Italian design which came here from who knows where. Now, did it come through Bideford and come down? Did it come up through Exeter? You know, it's an odd place, Hatherleigh. It has 2 African servants here in the early 1600s. How did they get here? Why Hatherleigh? You think the place is being removed, but they're not always what they look like. And with our bench ends, all it is about taking time to just look and enjoy yourself. Thank you very much.